The gunshot that rang through Belmont, Nevada, that scorching July afternoon in 1883 was not meant to kill, but it changed everything nonetheless. Clara Zimmerman pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The bullet had splintered the doorframe inches from where her hand had been reaching for the handle, and now fine particles of wood dust settled on her navy traveling dress like snow. She had only arrived in town 3 hours ago, stepping off the stagecoach with 2 worn leather cases and a letter of employment from the schoolhouse committee, and already someone was shooting at her, except the shot had not been aimed at her at all. "I said I want that horse." The voice was smooth, educated, utterly confident. Clara peered around the corner of the building to see a young man in expensive clothes, his vest embroidered with silver thread that caught the harsh desert sun. He held a polished revolver casually in one hand, pointed skyward now, smoke still curling from the barrel. His other hand rested on his hip, and everything about his posture suggested he had never once in his life been told no. "My father owns half this town and most of the land around it. That includes whatever I decide I want." The object of his desire was a magnificent roan stallion tied to the hitching post outside the saloon. The horse was tall and powerfully built, with intelligent eyes that watched the scene with what Clara could have sworn was disdain. Standing between the entitled young man and the animal was someone entirely different. The cowboy was tall and lean, built like he had been carved from the same hard rock as the mountains surrounding Belmont. His hat was pushed back enough that Clara could see his face, all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, probably somewhere in his mid-20s. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and he wore no gun on his hip that Clara could see. His hands, she noticed, were very steady as they rested at his sides. "The horse belongs to me," the cowboy said, and his voice was quiet but it carried. There was something in it that made Clara lean forward to hear better, something that suggested he had seen things that the rich young man in his fancy vest could not begin to imagine. "I raised him from a colt. His name is Copper and he is not for sale. I was not offering to buy him." The entitled young man took a step forward, and Clara saw several townspeople on the street edge away. "I am Thomas Yates. My father is Richard Yates. Do you understand what that means?" "It means your father is the landowner up at the big house north of town," the cowboy replied. His voice had not changed at all, still quiet, still steady. "It means you grew up with people telling you that you could have whatever you wanted. It means you have never learned the difference between owning land and owning the world." Thomas Yates's face flushed red. He was handsome in a soft way, Clara thought, like someone who had never missed a meal or spent a night sleeping on hard ground. His dark hair was carefully pomaded, his skin unmarked by the sun or by hardship. He could not have been much older than 22 or 23, but he carried himself like a king. "You are going to regret speaking to me that way," Thomas said, and he raised the gun again. The cowboy moved so fast that Clara almost missed it. One moment he was standing still, the next he had crossed the distance between them, and his hand was locked around Thomas's wrist, angling the gun toward the sky. There was a brief struggle, Thomas crying out in anger and surprise, and then the gun was on the ground and the cowboy was holding Thomas's arm twisted behind his back. "You do not point a gun at someone unless you intend to use it," the cowboy said, still in that same quiet voice. "And you do not use it over something as foolish as wanting another man's horse. Now, I am going to let you go, and you are going to walk away and think about whether your father's name is worth dying over." He released Thomas with a gentle push. The landowner's son stumbled forward, caught himself, and spun around with fury written across his features. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually attack with his fists, but something in the cowboy's expression stopped him. Instead, Thomas bent and snatched his gun from the dirt, shoving it back into his holster with shaking hands. "You have no idea what you have just done," Thomas hissed. "My father will have you run out of this territory. You will never work again. I will make sure of it." "That is your right to try," the cowboy said. He turned his back on Thomas, which Clara thought was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and walked to his horse. He ran a hand down the stallion's neck with obvious affection. "Come on, Copper. Let us get you some water." Thomas Yates stood there for another long moment, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. And then he turned and strode away toward the far end of town, where Clara had glimpsed a massive two-story house on the hillside. The people who had been watching from doorways and windows began to slowly emerge, and the normal sounds of the town started up again. But Clara noticed that several of them looked worried. She stepped fully away from the wall of the general store, brushing wood dust from her dress. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them together to still them. She was the new schoolteacher. She could not afford to appear frightened, even though her heart was still racing from the violence she had just witnessed. She had left everything she knew in Philadelphia to come west and make a new life, and she would not let a single afternoon's excitement undo her resolve. The cowboy was leading his horse toward the water trough, and Clara found her feet carrying her in that direction before she had fully decided to move. She did not know why exactly, except that she wanted to thank him for not letting the situation become worse, and perhaps to warn him that he seemed to have made a powerful enemy. "Excuse me," she called out. He turned, and for the first time she saw his face fully in the light. He had gray eyes, she noticed, pale as silver and striking against his tanned skin. There was a scar along his jawline, thin and white, and his expression was guarded in a way that suggested he was used to trouble finding him. "Yes, miss," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more automatic politeness than real interest. "I wanted to thank you," Clara said, "for not letting that situation become worse. I was standing quite close to where that bullet hit, and I appreciate that you resolved things without more shooting." His eyes flicked to her dress, taking in the travel dust and the quality of the fabric, and then to the stage coach station behind her. "You just arrived in town." "About 3 hours ago," Clara confirmed. She held out her hand, then remembered that Western men might not shake hands with women the way her father and his colleagues did back east. But the cowboy took her hand anyway, his grip firm but brief. His palm was calloused, rough with work. "I am Clara Zimmerman. I am the new schoolteacher." Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening around his eyes. "Tristan York," he said. "I work at the Double C Ranch about 5 miles south of town, and I would not thank me too quickly. What you saw just now is going to cause trouble." "The young man, Thomas Yates, he threatened you," Clara said. "Is his father really so powerful? Richard Yates owns about 10,000 acres of land in these parts," Tristan said. He turned back to his horse, letting Copper drink from the trough. "He employs probably 50 men between his ranch hands and his mines. He supplies beef to the army forts and to the railroad camps. When Richard Yates wants something to happen in Belmont, it generally happens." "But surely he cannot just run people out of town for refusing to give his son a horse," Clara protested. "There must be law here, a sheriff." Tristan smiled, but there was no humor in it. "There is a sheriff. His name is Wade Cooper, and his salary is paid by the town council, which includes Richard Yates and 2 men who owe Yates significant sums of money. So yes, if Richard Yates decides he wants me gone, I will be gone. Clara felt a flash of anger on his behalf. "That is not right." "No, miss, it is not," Tristan agreed. He straightened up and Clara realized he was quite tall, probably 6 feet or a bit more. "But it is the way things are. You will find that the West is full of things that are not right and precious few people with the power to change them. My advice to you is to keep your head down, teach your students, and do not get involved in disputes between men like Thomas Yates and men like me." He touched his hat again, preparing to leave, but Clara felt a strange reluctance to let him go. "What will you do?" she asked. "Same thing I have been doing," Tristan said. "Work hard, keep to myself, and hope that Thomas Yates finds some other toy to play with. Now if you will excuse me, miss, I need to get supplies and head back to the ranch before dark." He led Copper away, and Clara stood by the water trough watching him go. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the easy way he moved, that spoke of strength and competence. She found herself hoping that the Yates family would forget about him, though she suspected that was unlikely. Men like Thomas Yates, in her experience, did not forget being humiliated. She turned back toward the general store to retrieve her bags and find the boarding house where she would be staying. The proprietor, a weathered woman named Mrs. Henderson, had rooms for single teachers and ranch hands who came to town on their days off. As Clara climbed the stairs to her small but clean room, she could hear conversations drifting up from the street below, and more than once she heard the names Tristan York and Thomas Yates spoken in worried tones. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed listening to unfamiliar sounds, Clara thought about gray eyes and quiet voices, and the way Tristan York had moved to disarm Thomas Yates without any wasted motion. She thought about the gentleness in his hands when he touched his horse, and the hardness in his voice when he spoke about the way power worked in Belmont. She had come west looking for independence and purpose, for a chance to make a difference in young lives, but she had not expected to find herself thinking about a cowboy who stood up to bullies, even when it would cost him dearly. She did not know then that she would see Tristan York again much sooner than expected, or that the confrontation she had witnessed was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a dispute over a horse. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building on the eastern edge of town, painted white but weathered gray in places where the paint had peeled away under the relentless sun. Clara arrived early the next morning, carrying her books and slate and the nervous excitement of a first day. She had taught before in Philadelphia, but this was different. These children would be the sons and daughters of miners and ranchers, of shopkeepers and saloon owners, and they would need different things than the well-fed children of merchants and lawyers she had known back east. The door was unlocked, and inside she found a single large room with benches and desks arranged in rows, a blackboard on one wall, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner for winter. It was sparse but functional, and Clara felt a surge of affection for it. This was hers. This was where she would make her mark. She spent the morning preparing lessons and organizing supplies, and when the children began arriving around 8 o'clock, she greeted each one at the door. There were 14 students in total, ranging in age from 6 to 15. The older ones looked skeptical, particularly the boys, but Clara had learned long ago that skepticism could be won over with patience and genuine interest. By noon, she felt she had made a good start. The children were responsive, if a bit rowdy, and she had managed to gauge their various levels of reading and arithmetic. She was just dismissing them for their lunch break when a shadow fell across the doorway. Thomas Yates stood there, dressed even more finely than he had been the day before. His vest was deep blue, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was not wearing his gun, Clara noticed with relief, but there was something in his smile that made her uneasy. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, and his voice was smooth as honey. "I heard we had a new schoolteacher in town. I wanted to welcome you properly." The children filed past him, giving him a wide berth, and Clara waited until they were all outside before responding. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. That is very kind. Please call me Thomas." He stepped inside, looking around the schoolhouse with an expression that suggested he found it charmingly quaint. "My father is very interested in education. He donated funds to repair the roof 2 years ago after the winter storms damaged it." "That was generous of him," Clara said carefully. She moved behind her desk, putting the solid wood between them. Something about the way Thomas was looking at her made her skin prickle with warning. "We take care of this town," Thomas continued. He picked up one of the books she had brought from Philadelphia, a collection of poetry, and flipped through it idly. "My father believes that a town with a good school and a pretty teacher is a town that will attract quality settlers. And you are very pretty, Miss Zimmerman, if you do not mind my saying so." "I do mind, actually," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "I would prefer to be valued for my education and my teaching ability rather than my appearance." Thomas laughed, but his eyes had gone cold. "Of course. I meant no offense. I simply wanted to introduce myself and to offer my services should you need anything at all. My father would be very pleased if I could be of assistance to you." "I appreciate the offer," Clara said, "but I believe I have everything I need at present." "Do you?" Thomas set the book down and moved closer to the desk. "Because I understand, you witnessed that unpleasant scene yesterday with the drifter and his horse. I hope it did not frighten you too badly." "Mr. York did not seem like a drifter to me," Clara said before she could stop herself. "He seemed like a working man defending his property." Thomas's expression darkened. "Tristan York is a nobody, a ranch hand who moves from place to place because he cannot hold steady work. He is also a man who put his hands on me, which is something no one does. I wanted to make sure you understood that, so you do not get the wrong impression of how things work in Belmont." "I understand perfectly how things work," Clara said, and she heard the ice in her own voice. "You believe that your father's wealth gives you the right to take whatever you want, including other people's horses and other people's dignity. Mr. York showed admirable restraint in not hurting you more seriously than he did." The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Thomas stared at her, and Clara saw the same fury in his face that she had seen the day before when Tristan had disarmed him. For a moment she thought she had gone too far, that he might actually do something violent, but then he smiled again, and somehow that was worse than the anger. "I see," he said softly. "You are one of those Eastern women who come west thinking they understand how things work. Let me give you some free advice, Miss Zimmerman. In Belmont, you are either with the Yates family or you are against us. There is no middle ground. I suggest you think carefully about which side you want to be on." He turned and walked out, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and Clara sank into her chair with her heart pounding. She had been in Belmont less than 24 hours, and she had already made an enemy of the most powerful family in town. It was, she reflected grimly, probably some kind of record. The afternoon classes passed in a blur. Clara taught geography and history, heard recitations, and corrected arithmetic problems, but part of her mind was still on Thomas Yates and his thinly veiled threats. When the last student left for the day, she locked the schoolhouse door and began the walk back to the boarding house, lost in thought. She was so distracted that she almost walked right past Tristan York. He was sitting on the steps of the general store, a bag of supplies beside him, and he stood when he saw her. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, and there was concern in his gray eyes. "I heard Thomas Yates paid you a visit at the schoolhouse today. Word travels fast in a small town, Clara said. When it involves Thomas Yates, it travels even faster, Tristan replied. What did he want? Clara hesitated, then decided that honesty was better than evasion. He wanted to make sure I understood that his family is very powerful, and that I should not form any alliances with people who cross them. He also informed me that you are a drifter and a troublemaker. Tristan grimaced. He is not entirely wrong about the troublemaker part, though I generally do not go looking for it. As for being a drifter, I have been working at the Double C for 2 years, which is longer than I have stayed anywhere in a while, but that is my business. What concerns me is that he targeted you because you witnessed what happened yesterday. I am sorry for that. You have nothing to apologize for, Clara said firmly. I spoke to him the way I did because I chose to, not because of anything you did. I do not care for bullies, Mr. York, whether they are schoolyard children or grown men with wealthy fathers. Something like respect flickered across Tristan's face. That is a dangerous attitude to have in this town, Miss Zimmerman. Perhaps, Clara acknowledged. But I did not come all the way from Philadelphia to spend my time bowing and scraping to people like Thomas Yates. I came here to teach children, and I intend to do exactly that, regardless of who it offends. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, and Clara felt something pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both outsiders in their own ways, both people who had chosen difficult paths, because the alternative was to compromise something essential in themselves. I should get back to the ranch, Tristan said finally. But Miss Zimmerman, please be careful. Thomas Yates is not just arrogant, he is dangerous. He has hurt people before when they crossed him, and his father always makes it go away. I would not want to see you become another problem that Richard Yates has to solve. I will be careful, Clara promised. But you should take your own advice, Mr. York. Something tells me that Thomas has not forgotten about your horse. No, I imagine he has not, Tristan agreed. He picked up his bag of supplies and walked to where Copper was tied. As he swung up into the saddle with easy grace, he looked down at Clara and touched his hat. Good evening, Miss Zimmerman. I hope your teaching goes well. Good evening, Mr. York. Clara watched him ride out of town, and she felt that strange reluctance again, that sense of something unfinished. She shook her head at her own foolishness. She barely knew the man. He was a cowboy, she was a schoolteacher, and their paths had crossed by accident. There was no reason to feel this pull toward him, no reason to stand here watching until he disappeared into the sagebrush and desert beyond the town limits. But she stood there anyway, until he was gone and the evening was settling in around her like a blanket. The trouble, when it came, was not what Clara expected. She had been in Belmont for 2 weeks, settling into a rhythm with her students, making friends with Mrs. Henderson, and with Sarah Chen, the young woman who ran the laundry service and whose family had come from China to work on the railroad before settling in Nevada. Clara had not seen Thomas Yates again, and she had begun to hope that he had lost interest in bothering her. Tristan York she had seen twice, both times in town buying supplies. They had exchanged polite greetings, nothing more, though Clara found herself looking for him each time she walked down the main street. It was foolish, she knew, but she could not seem to help it. There was something about him that drew her, some quality of quiet strength that she found herself thinking about at odd moments. Then one afternoon, one of her students, a 12-year-old girl named Emma, did not show up for class. This was unusual because Emma was one of her best students, always eager to learn and never absent without cause. When Clara asked the other children, they exchanged worried looks but said nothing until the end of the day, when Emma's younger brother, a boy of 8 named Jack, lingered behind. Miss Zimmerman, he said, his voice small, Emma is not sick, she is hiding. Hiding? Clara knelt down to his level. Why is she hiding, Jack? The boy's eyes filled with tears. Because Mr. Thomas came to our house yesterday. He said Emma was very pretty and that she should come work at the big house as a maid. Our pa said no because Emma helps Ma with the washing and the younger kids, but Mr. Thomas said he was not asking. He said Emma would start next week whether Pa agreed or not. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. Where does your family live, Jack? He gave her directions to a small homestead on the edge of the Yates property, and Clara dismissed him with a promise that she would see what she could do. Then she sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the blackboard and thinking hard. Emma was 12 years old enough to work in some places, but still a child in Clara's eyes. And there was something about the way Jack had said Thomas was not asking that made Clara deeply uneasy. She had heard stories, back in Philadelphia, and since coming west, about powerful men who used their positions to prey on vulnerable girls. She had always told herself that if she ever encountered such a situation, she would act, regardless of the consequences. Now she had to decide if she really meant it. By the time Clara reached the Yates house, the sun was setting, and she had worked herself into a cold fury. The house was enormous, 3 stories of painted wood with a wraparound porch and actual glass windows, a monument to wealth in a landscape of hardship. She marched up the front steps and knocked firmly on the door. A middle-aged man in a suit answered, clearly some kind of butler or house servant, and looked at her with surprise. "Yes, miss. I am here to speak with Thomas Yates," Clara said. "Please tell him that Miss Zimmerman, the schoolteacher, needs to see him on an urgent matter." The man hesitated, then nodded and disappeared inside. Clara waited, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from shaking. She was angry, yes, but she was also frightened. This was not like speaking sharply to Thomas in the schoolhouse. This was coming to his home, challenging him on his own ground. When Thomas appeared, he looked amused. "Miss Zimmerman, what a pleasant surprise. Have you reconsidered your position on my family? I am here about Emma Garrett," Clara said without preamble. "She is 12 years old and one of my students. I understand you have informed her family that she will be working at this house." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Word does travel fast. Yes, I offered the girl employment. Her family is poor, and I thought I was being generous." "She is a child," Clara said flatly. "She belongs in school, not working as a maid in your house. I would like you to withdraw your offer." "Would you?" Thomas stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. His amusement had vanished, replaced by cold anger. "And why exactly would I do that?" "Because it is the right thing to do," Clara said. "Because she is too young, because her family needs her at home, and because I suspect your motives are not as generous as you claim." The slap came so fast that Clara did not have time to react. One moment she was standing there meeting Thomas's gaze. The next her head had snapped to the side and her cheek was burning with pain. She stumbled back, catching herself on the porch railing, and looked up to see Thomas standing over her with his hand still raised. "You do not speak to me that way," he hissed. "You do not come to my home and accuse me of improper behavior. I could have you run out of this town before sunrise, do you understand? I could make sure you never teach anywhere in this territory again." Clara's cheek throbbed and she could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue, but she forced herself to straighten up and look him in the eye. "Do what you like to me," she said, and her voice shook only slightly. "But leave Emma Garrett alone. She is a child." Thomas smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Clara had ever seen. "No, Miss Zimmerman, I do not think I will. In fact, I think I will make a point of it now. Emma will start work here on Monday, and if her family refuses, I will see to it that they lose their homestead." My father owns the land they are renting, and one word from me will have them evicted. As for you, consider this your warning. Cross me again, and it will not just be your job you lose." He turned and went back inside, leaving Clara standing on the porch with her cheek burning and her heart pounding. She made her way down the steps slowly, her legs weak, and she had gone maybe 50 yards down the road toward town when a rider appeared out of the twilight. It was Tristan York on his roan stallion, and he took one look at Clara's face and swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion. "What happened?" he demanded, and there was something in his voice that Clara had not heard before, something cold and dangerous. "I went to speak with Thomas Yates," Clara said. She put a hand to her cheek and was not surprised when it came away with a small smear of blood from where his ring had cut the skin. It did not go well. Tristan's jaw tightened. "He hit you." It was not a question, and Clara did not bother to deny it. "He is planning to force a 12-year-old girl to work at his house, and when I confronted him about it, he informed me that he could do as he pleased. I should have expected this. I was foolish to think I could reason with him." "You were not foolish," Tristan said quietly. "You were brave." But bravery without backup just gets people hurt. He stood there for a moment, looking back at the Yates house with an expression that made Clara think of storms gathering on the horizon. "Wait here." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, alarmed. "What I should have done 2 weeks ago," Tristan replied. He started toward the house, but Clara caught his arm. "Please do not," she said. "He will have you arrested or worse. His father will destroy you." Tristan looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and something in his expression softened. "Miss Zimmerman, I have been running from men like Thomas Yates my whole life. I am done running. But I will not do anything stupid, I promise you. I just need to make something very clear to him." He pulled free gently and walked up to the front door, and Clara stood there in the growing dark with her heart in her throat, not knowing what else to do. She heard Tristan knock, heard the door open, and then heard his voice, quiet but carrying in the still evening air. "Thomas Yates, you need to come out here." There was a pause, and then Thomas appeared in the doorway. He saw Tristan, and his expression turned ugly. "You. I should have known you would be involved in this. Have you been filling the schoolteacher's head with ideas about standing up to me?" "I have not spoken to Miss Zimmerman about you at all," Tristan said, "but I am speaking to you now. You do not hit women. You do not force children to work in your house. You do not threaten people who are trying to do the right thing. This stops now." Thomas laughed. "Or what? You will disarm me again. My father already has plans to deal with you, York. By this time next week, you will be out of work and out of this territory. As for the Garrett girl, she will be here on Monday, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do about it." "We will see about that," Tristan said. He turned and walked back to where Clara was standing, and as he passed her he said quietly, "Go back to town. Stay at the boarding house. I will handle this." "How?" Clara asked desperately. "How can you handle this? He is right, his father owns half the county." Tristan swung back up into his saddle and looked down at her, and in the last light of the day his eyes were silver and fierce. "Richard Yates owns land and cattle and mines, but he does not own people, not really, and there are more of us than there are of them. Trust me, Miss Zimmerman. This is not over." He rode off into the darkness, and Clara walked slowly back to town, her mind spinning. She did not know what Tristan meant to do, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had just made everything worse. Thomas Yates would not forget this, and now both she and Tristan were in his sights. When she reached the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson took one look at her face and ushered her inside, applying a cold cloth to her bruised cheek and clucking with concern. "You went up to the Yates place," the older woman said. "It was not a question." "How did you know?" Clara asked. Because you have that look about you like you have just learned something hard about the world, Mrs. Henderson replied. She sat down across from Clara with a sigh. Let me guess. Thomas Yates did something unforgivable. You confronted him, and he reminded you that he can do as he pleases in this town. Something like that, Clara said. She told Mrs. Henderson about Emma Garrett, about Thomas's threats, about Tristan's appearance and his promise to handle things. When she finished, the older woman shook her head. Tristan York is a good man, but he is just one man, Mrs. Henderson said. What can he do against the Yates family? Clara did not have an answer to that. She went to bed that night with her cheek still aching and her mind full of worry, and she did not sleep well. In her dreams, she saw Thomas Yates's cruel smile and Tristan York riding off into darkness, and she woke before dawn with the terrible feeling that something bad was going to happen. But what happened instead was something Clara had not anticipated at all. By mid-morning the next day, nearly every ranch hand and miner and homesteader within 10 miles of Belmont had gathered in the town square. There were at least 60 men, all of them armed, all of them grim-faced. Tristan York stood at the front of the group, and when he saw Clara emerge from the schoolhouse, he nodded to her. "What is happening?" Clara asked, pushing through the crowd to reach him. "A reckoning," Tristan said simply. He raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "Richard Yates is about to learn that he does not own this town or the people in it. We are going up to his house, all of us together, and we are going to tell him that his son's behavior stops today. No more threats, no more taking what does not belong to him, no more preying on children." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Tristan, this is dangerous. If it turns violent, it will not," Tristan said, and his voice was calm. "There are too many of us and too few of them. Richard Yates is a businessman. He understands numbers. When he sees that the people who work his land and dig his ore and buy supplies in his town are united against him, he will have to listen. And if he does not," Clara pressed. Tristan met her eyes, and she saw in them a determination that went bone deep. "Then we will make our own justice. But it will not come to that. Trust me." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that this could all go wrong in 100 different ways, but she saw the resolve in the faces around her and knew that this moment had been building for longer than just the past 2 weeks. These were men who had been pushed too far, who had seen the Yates family take and take and take without consequence, and they had finally reached their breaking point. "I am coming with you," Clara said. "No," Tristan said immediately. "This is not. I am the reason this is happening right now," Clara interrupted. "Emma Garrett is my student. Thomas hit me. I am part of this whether you like it or not, and I will not sit safely in town while you all take the risk. Besides, Richard Yates might be more inclined to listen if there is a woman present to shame him into decency." Tristan looked like he wanted to argue further, but one of the other men, a grizzled rancher named Pete, spoke up. "She has a point. Might help to have a schoolteacher there to speak for the Garrett girl." After a moment, Tristan nodded reluctantly. "Stay close to me," he said to Clara, "and if things go bad, you run. Understood?" "Understood," Clara agreed, though she had no intention of running if trouble started. The group moved out of town like a slow-moving storm. Dozens of men on horseback and on foot, with Clara riding behind Tristan on Copper, because he insisted she not walk the whole distance. It was strange to be so close to him, her arms around his waist for balance, feeling the solid warmth of him and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Under different circumstances it might have been pleasant, but now all Clara could think about was what they were riding toward. The Yates house looked less impressive when approached by an angry crowd. Richard Yates himself came out onto the porch when they were still 100 yards away, and Clara saw him blanch at the sight of so many men. He was older than she had expected, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a hard face that suggested he had not gotten wealthy by being soft. Thomas appeared beside him, and his expression went from confusion to fury when he saw Tristan at the head of the group. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard Yates called out when they had stopped in front of his house. "This is private property. You are all trespassing." Tristan dismounted and helped Clara down before stepping forward. "Mr. Yates, we are here to talk about your son's behavior. Specifically, his habit of taking what does not belong to him and threatening anyone who objects." "My son is allowed to hire servants if he chooses," Richard said stiffly. "And if you are referring to that business with the horse, Thomas has already explained that you assaulted him." "I disarmed him when he was waving a gun around town like a fool," Tristan corrected. "And we are not here about the horse. We are here about Emma Garrett, a 12-year-old child that Thomas is trying to force to work in this house. We are here about Miss Zimmerman, who your son struck across the face for daring to object. We are here because your family has been treating this town like your personal property for too long, and it stops today." A rumble of agreement came from the men behind him, and Clara saw Richard Yates's expression shift from anger to calculation. He was looking at the crowd, counting numbers, assessing threats. Thomas started to speak, but his father held up a hand to silence him. "Let me be clear about something," Richard said, his voice carrying across the distance. "I have built everything I have through hard work and smart business. I employ most of you, directly or indirectly. I have provided loans to many of your families when the banks would not. I have every right to expect loyalty in return." "Loyalty is earned, not bought," Tristan said. "And you lost our loyalty when you let your son act like a tyrant. We are not asking for anything unreasonable, Mr. Yates. We are asking that Thomas leave Emma Garrett alone, that he apologize to Miss Zimmerman for striking her, and that you make it clear to him that he cannot go around threatening and hurting people whenever he does not get his way." "And if I refuse?" Richard asked. "Then we stop working for you," Tristan said simply. "Every man here. We quit your ranches, we quit your mines, we stop buying supplies from businesses that you own. We tell every homesteader and settler who comes through Belmont that this is a town where the Yates family thinks they can do as they please. You will find it very difficult to run your enterprises without workers, Mr. Yates. And very difficult to maintain your wealth when your reputation drives people away." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara held her breath, watching Richard Yates's face. She could see him thinking, weighing his options, trying to find a way to win this confrontation. But there was no way to win when faced with united opposition, and Richard Yates was smart enough to know it. Finally, he turned to his son. "Did you hit Miss Zimmerman?" "She came here making accusations," Thomas said, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "She called me. Did you hit her?" Richard repeated, his voice like iron. Thomas hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, Clara saw something that might have been disappointment or might have been calculation. "Apologize to her. Now." "Father, I will not now, Thomas, or I will disinherit you where you stand." The threat hung in the air like a blade, and Clara saw Thomas realize that his father was serious. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, Thomas descended the porch steps and walked toward Clara. His face was twisted with humiliation and fury, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I apologize for striking you, Miss Zimmerman. It was inappropriate." It was possibly the least sincere apology Clara had ever heard, but she nodded acceptance because pushing for more would only make things worse. Thomas turned and went back to the porch without waiting for a response, and Richard Yates spoke again. As for the Garrett girl, I was not aware that she was so young or that my son had threatened the family. The offer of employment is withdrawn. Will that satisfy you? It was Tristan who answered. For now. But understand this, Mr. Yates. We will be watching. If Thomas steps out of line again, if he threatens or hurts anyone else, we will not come here asking nicely. We will go to the territorial governor, to the newspapers, to anyone who will listen. Your family's reputation will not survive that kind of scrutiny. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. You have made your point. Now get off my property before I change my mind about being reasonable. The crowd began to disperse, men mounting horses and walking back toward town with expressions of grim satisfaction. Tristan helped Clara back onto Copper, and they rode away from the Yates house without looking back. Clara could feel Thomas's eyes on them, could sense the hatred radiating from him like heat, but she refused to turn around. When they reached the town square, the men scattered to their homes and jobs, and Tristan dismounted and helped Clara down. Her legs were shaking slightly, and she realized that the tension of the past hour had taken more out of her than she had thought. Are you all right? Tristan asked, his hand steadying her elbow. I think so, Clara said. That was terrifying. Yes, it was, Tristan agreed, but it worked. Emma Garrett is safe and Thomas has been put in his place, at least for now. Do you think it will last? Clara asked. The truce, I mean. Or will Thomas find some way to get revenge? Tristan was quiet for a moment, looking back in the direction of the Yates house. I do not know, he admitted. Men like Thomas do not forget being humiliated. But his father knows that his business depends on the goodwill of the people in this territory, and that will keep him in check. As for Thomas himself, well, we will have to wait and see. Clara nodded, but she felt a lingering unease. They had won today, but she could not shake the feeling that this was far from over. Still, she managed a smile as she looked up at Tristan. Thank you for organizing this, for standing up for Emma and for me. You did not have to do any of that. Yes, I did, Tristan said quietly. His gray eyes were serious. I have spent a lot of years walking away from trouble, moving on to the next town when things got difficult. But there comes a time when you have to stand for something, even if it costs you. Maybe especially if it costs you. And I was not about to let Thomas Yates hurt a child or a woman who was trying to protect her. There was something in his voice that made Clara's heart beat faster, something that went beyond simple admiration or gratitude. She found herself noticing details she had overlooked before, the way his hair curled slightly at his neck where it needed cutting, the small scar on his lower lip, the way his hands rested easy on his belt, ready but not tense. He was handsome in a weathered way, she realized, all sharp edges and quiet strength, and when he looked at her like he was looking at her now, she felt something stir inside her that she had never felt before. Will you have dinner with me? The words were out before Clara could stop them, and she felt her cheeks flush. I mean, as a thank you. Mrs. Henderson serves meals at the boarding house, and you should eat something after all that. Tristan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. I would like that very much, Miss Zimmerman. Clara, she said. You can call me Clara. After everything that has happened, I think we can dispense with formality. Clara, Tristan repeated, and the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, made her heart do something complicated in her chest. And you should call me Tristan. They walked together to the boarding house, leading Copper behind them, and Clara felt the eyes of the town on them. People were whispering, she knew, about the confrontation at the Yates house, about Tristan and Clara standing together against the most powerful family in the county. Part of her knew she should be worried about her reputation, about what people would say about an unmarried schoolteacher spending time with a cowboy, but she found that she did not care. For the first time since arriving in Belmont, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, Mrs. Henderson served them roast chicken and potatoes, fresh bread and apple pie, and if she was surprised to see Tristan York dining at her table, she did not show it. She simply piled their plates high and left them to talk, though Clara caught her smiling knowingly as she retreated to the kitchen. "Tell me about yourself," Clara said as they ate. "How does a person end up being a ranch hand in Nevada?" Tristan was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "It is a long story," he said finally. "But the short version is that I was born in Texas, lost my parents to fever when I was 16, and have been moving around ever since. I have worked cattle drives, mined for gold, built fences, broken horses, whatever paid and kept me moving." "Why keep moving?" Clara asked gently. "Because staying still meant putting down roots, and roots meant caring about things," Tristan said. "And caring about things meant losing them eventually. It seemed easier to just drift, to take work where I found it and move on when it got complicated." "But you stopped drifting when you came to Belmont," Clara observed. "You said you have been at the Double C for 2 years. That is more than just drifting." Tristan nodded slowly. "I suppose it is. The Double C is owned by a man named Charlie Clayton, and he treated me fair from the start. Paid well, gave me work I was good at, left me alone when I needed to be alone. I kept meaning to move on, but something always made me stay. And then today happened, and I realized that maybe I have been putting down roots without noticing." "Is that a bad thing?" Clara asked. "I do not know yet," Tristan admitted. He looked at her across the table, and his expression was uncertain in a way that made him seem younger. "What about you? What makes a schoolteacher from Philadelphia come all the way to Nevada?" It was Clara's turn to hesitate. "I wanted to be useful," she said finally. "In Philadelphia, I taught the children of wealthy families, and while the work was fine, it did not feel important. Out here, children need teachers. They need someone to open up the world for them, to show them that there is more to life than survival and hardship. I wanted to make a real difference." "And have you?" Tristan asked. "Made a difference?" Clara thought about Emma Garrett, safe now because people had stood up for her. She thought about her students, eager and bright and hungry for knowledge. She thought about standing on the porch of the Yates house with her cheek burning and her chin raised, refusing to back down. "I think I am starting to," she said. They talked through dinner and into the evening, and Clara found herself telling Tristan things she had not told anyone else. About her father who had wanted her to marry a lawyer and settle into a safe, boring life. About her mother who had died when Clara was 12 and left her feeling unmoored ever since. Tristan told her about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the long, lonely years after his parents died when he had no one but himself to rely on. The sun had set, and the lamps were lit by the time they finally ran out of words. Tristan stood, settling his hat on his head, and Clara walked him to the door. Outside, Copper waited patiently at the hitching post, and the night air was cool and clear. "Thank you for dinner," Tristan said. "And for the conversation. I have not talked that much in years." "Thank you for listening," Clara replied. "And for today, for everything." They stood there in the doorway, and Clara felt the moment stretch between them, full of possibility. She thought Tristan might kiss her, and part of her desperately wanted him to, but instead he just touched the brim of his hat and stepped back. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Tristan." She watched him ride away, and this time when he disappeared into the darkness, she did not feel sad. She felt hopeful, like something was beginning instead of ending. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Thomas Yates was conspicuously absent from town, and word spread that Richard had sent him to oversee some mining operations in the northern part of the territory, far away from Belmont. Emma Garrett returned to school, smiling and relieved, and Clara threw herself into teaching with renewed energy. Tristan came to town twice a week for supplies, and each time he found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or to share a meal at the boarding house. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and horses, and the way the desert looked at sunset. Clara learned that Tristan had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he was remarkably well-read for someone who had spent most of his adult life working with his hands, and that he had a gentle patience with animals that spoke of deep kindness. For his part, Tristan seemed to slowly unfold in her presence, becoming less guarded and more open. He smiled more often, laughed at her observations about her students, and once brought her a wildflower he had found growing impossibly in the harsh desert soil, presenting it with a shy awkwardness that made Clara's heart ache. "I thought you might like it," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It reminded me of you, beautiful and stubborn enough to bloom where nothing else will." Clara had pressed the flower between the pages of her favorite book, and sometimes she opened it just to look at the dried petals and remember the way Tristan had looked when he gave it to her. People in town began to talk, of course. Clara heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks. A schoolteacher and a cowboy, what a pair! Some of the gossip was kind, some of it less so. There were those who thought Clara was foolish to waste her time on a drifter, and those who thought Tristan was reaching above his station by courting an educated Eastern woman. But there were also those who smiled when they saw them together, who remembered the day Tristan had stood up to the Yates family, and thought that maybe this was exactly what Belmont needed, a reminder that courage and decency mattered more than money and power. Charlie Clayton, Tristan's employer, came to town one Saturday and sought Clara out at the general store. He was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Clara asked, surprised. "For bringing Tristan York back to life," Charlie said simply. "He has worked for me for 2 years and he has been a good hand, reliable and skilled. But there was something closed off about him, like he was just going through the motions. Since he met you, that has changed. He smiles now. He talks to the other men. He acts like he has something to live for besides the next paycheck. So thank you for that." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "I think he has done more for me than I have for him," she said honestly. "He reminded me why I came west in the first place. To be brave, to stand up for what matters." Charlie nodded approvingly. "You are good for each other, then. That is how it should be." The conversation stayed with Clara for days afterward, and she found herself thinking more and more about what it would mean to build a life with Tristan. It was early yet, she knew. They had only known each other for a few months, but there was something between them that felt solid and true, something that went deeper than simple attraction or convenience. Then one evening in early October, as the desert air was finally beginning to cool and the light turned golden, Tristan asked Clara to go riding with him. She had never been on a horse before coming west, but he had been teaching her, and she could now manage a gentle mare from the Double C without too much difficulty. They rode out of town toward the mountains, following a trail that wound through sagebrush and desert scrub. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed impossible, and Clara felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was what she had come west for, she realized. Not just to teach, but to feel this sense of space and freedom, to be in a place where the horizon seemed endless and anything felt possible. Tristan led them to a small canyon where a spring created a tiny oasis of green. There were cottonwood trees here, their leaves turning gold and the sound of water trickling over rocks. They dismounted and stood together in the fading light, and Clara felt Tristan take her hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, and there was nervousness in his voice that Clara had never heard before. "What is it?" she asked, turning to face him. "I am not good with words," Tristan said. "I never have been. But I need you to know that these past few months have been the happiest of my life. I look forward to the days when I can come to town, because I know I will see you. I think about things you have said when I am working. I find myself wanting to tell you about my day, about things I have seen or thoughts I have had. And I realize that what I am feeling is not just friendship or admiration. I am in love with you, Clara. I have been for a while now, and I needed to say it out loud." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "Tristan," she whispered, "you do not have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I know I am just a ranch hand with no real prospects, and you are an educated woman who could have anyone. I am not asking you to make promises or decisions. I just needed you to know how I feel." "Stop talking," Clara said, and she stepped forward and kissed him. For a moment Tristan was frozen in surprise, and then his arms came around her and he was kissing her back, gentle and fierce all at once. Clara had been kissed before, by suitors back in Philadelphia who smelled of cologne and had soft hands, but it had never felt like this. This felt like coming home, like finding something she had not known she was looking for. Tristan tasted like coffee and smelled like leather and horse and the clean desert air, and when he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "I love you too," Clara said, her hands fisted in his shirt. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you stood up to Thomas Yates over your horse. Maybe even before that, when I saw the way you looked at Copper with such obvious affection. I love that you are brave and kind and patient. I love that you make me laugh and make me think. I love that you see me as I really am and do not try to make me into something else." Tristan's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Are you sure? Because once you commit to this to me, I am not letting go. I have spent years running from attachments, but I am done running. If you love me, then I am staying in Belmont for good. I am putting down roots. I am building a life, and I want to build it with you." "I am sure," Clara said firmly, "more sure than I have ever been about anything." They stood there in the little canyon as the stars came out, kissing and talking and making plans. Tristan told her about the piece of land he had been looking at, a small parcel near the Double C that Charlie was willing to sell him cheap. He had been saving his wages for years, he said, never quite sure what he was saving for, but now he knew. He would build a house there, nothing fancy at first, but solid and sturdy. He would raise horses, maybe run a few cattle. It would not make him rich, but it would be his. And Clara told him about her dream of expanding the school, of bringing in more books and supplies, of creating a library that all the children of Belmont could use. She told him about wanting a home of her own, a place where she could plant a garden and watch things grow in defiance of the harsh desert. She told him about wanting children someday, not right away but eventually, children who would grow up knowing both the value of education and the value of hard work. "We can do all of that," Tristan said, his voice full of wonder. "We can build something real together." "Yes," Clara agreed. "We can." They rode back to town in the dark, and when Tristan left her at the boarding house, he kissed her again, long and slow, and Clara felt like she was glowing from the inside out. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in the parlor when Clara came inside, and one look at her face made the older woman smile. "So it is settled then," she said. "You and Tristan York." "Yes," Clara said, unable to stop smiling. "It is settled." "Good," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "That boy needs someone to love, and you need someone to share your life with. I give you my blessing for what it is worth." "It is worth a great deal," Clara said warmly. "Thank you." That night Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too happy to sleep. She kept replaying the evening in her mind, the feel of Tristan's hands on her waist, the sound of his voice when he said he loved her. She had come west looking for purpose and had found so much more. She had found love, real and deep and lasting, with a man who saw her for exactly who she was and loved her for it. The future stretched out before her, full of possibility and promise, and for the first time in her life, Clara was not afraid of it. The trouble, when it returned, came from a direction Clara had not anticipated. It was early November, and Clara was walking back to the boarding house after a long day of teaching when she noticed a man following her. He was rough-looking, dressed in the kind of clothes that working men wore, but there was something off about him, something that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. She quickened her pace, and the man quickened his as well. She was only a block from the boarding house when he caught up to her, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the narrow space between two buildings. Clara opened her mouth to scream, but he clamped a hand over it, his other arm pinning her against the wall. "Do not make noise," he hissed, his breath hot and foul against her face. "I have a message for you from Thomas Yates. He wants you to know that he has not forgotten what you and your cowboy did. He wants you to know that there will be consequences." Clara struggled, but the man was much stronger than her. He leaned closer, his eyes cold. "Thomas says you have two choices. You can leave Belmont, pack up and go back east where you belong, or you can watch while bad things happen to the people you care about, starting with Tristan York." "Do you understand?" Clara managed to nod, and the man released her with a shove that sent her stumbling. By the time she recovered her balance, he was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk like a ghost. Clara stood there shaking, her heart pounding, and then she ran the rest of the way to the boarding house and up to her room, locking the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, trying to think. Thomas Yates was back, or at least his influence had returned. The threat was clear. Leave town, or Tristan would be hurt, maybe worse than hurt. Clara had no doubt that Thomas was capable of having someone killed if he thought he could get away with it. The question was what she should do about it. She could leave. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. She could write to the school board and resign, could pack her belongings and take the next stagecoach east. Tristan would be safe, and she would be gone before Thomas could carry out his threats. But the thought of leaving made Clara feel physically ill. She loved Tristan. She loved her students. She loved the life she was building in Belmont. And more than that, she refused to let a bully like Thomas Yates dictate her choices. She had not come west to run at the first sign of danger. She needed to tell Tristan what had happened. Together they could figure out what to do, could maybe go to the sheriff or reach out to the territorial authorities. There had to be something they could do to stop Thomas without giving in to his demands. The next morning, Clara sent a message to the Double C asking Tristan to meet her at the schoolhouse after classes ended. She taught through the day in a daze, her mind only half on the lessons, and when the last student left, she sat at her desk and waited. Tristan arrived 20 minutes later, his face creased with concern. "Your message sounded urgent. What happened?" Clara told him everything about the man who had grabbed her, about Thomas's threat. As she spoke, she watched Tristan's expression harden into something cold and dangerous. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he stood and paced to the window, staring out at the street. "He is trying to separate us," Tristan said finally. "He knows that together we are strong, that we have the support of the town, so he is trying to scare you into leaving." "I am not leaving," Clara said firmly. "I refuse to let him win." "Then we need to end this," Tristan said. He turned back to her, and his expression was grim. "We need to confront Thomas directly with witnesses and make it clear that his threats will not work. If we can force him to back down publicly, maybe he will finally give up." "And if he will not back down?" Clara asked. "Then we take the fight to his father," Tristan said. "Richard Yates shut Thomas down once before because it was affecting his business. If we can show him that Thomas's vendetta is causing real problems, he might intervene again." It was a plan, though Clara was not entirely sure it was a good one. But she could not think of anything better, and she trusted Tristan's judgment. They spent the next hour working out the details, and by the time Tristan left to return to the Double C, Clara felt slightly less terrified and slightly more determined. The confrontation happened 3 days later, on a crisp November morning when the sky was painfully blue and the air smelled of winter coming. Tristan had sent word through the network of ranch hands and miners, and once again a crowd gathered in the town square. This time there were even more people than before, including several women and older children. Clara stood at the front with Tristan, her heart pounding but her chin high. Thomas Yates arrived on horseback, flanked by 4 men Clara did not recognize. They were hired guns, she thought, men paid to intimidate and hurt people. Thomas looked confident as he dismounted, like he thought this was going to go his way. "York," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I heard you wanted to talk to me. About what?" "About the man you sent to threaten Miss Zimmerman," Tristan said evenly. "About your attempts to intimidate her into leaving town. About the fact that you cannot seem to accept that you do not get to have everything you want." Thomas laughed. "I do not know what you are talking about. I have been up north for weeks. I just got back yesterday." "We have a witness who says otherwise," Tristan said. One of the men from the crowd stepped forward. It was Pete, the rancher who had spoken up at the first confrontation. "Tell them what you saw, Pete." "I saw Thomas talking to a man named Jack Carter outside the saloon 2 weeks ago," Pete said. "I heard him describe Miss Zimmerman and tell Carter to deliver a message to her. I heard him say that she needed to be reminded of her place." Thomas's confident expression faltered. "That is a lie. He is making it up." "I am not," Pete said calmly, "and I am willing to swear to it in front of the territorial judge if necessary." More people stepped forward, each one adding a piece to the story. A woman who had seen one of Thomas's hired men watching the schoolhouse. A miner who had overheard Thomas bragging in the saloon about putting the uppity schoolteacher in her place. A shopkeeper who had seen Thomas meeting with known troublemakers. The evidence piled up, each testimony chipping away at Thomas's denials, and Clara watched his face go from confident to angry to something that looked like panic. "You are all conspiring against me," Thomas said, his voice rising. "My father will hear about this. He will make sure every one of you pays." "Your father is already hearing about it," a new voice said, and Clara turned to see Richard Yates himself riding into the square. He looked older than he had at their last confrontation, tired and grim. He dismounted and walked to stand beside his son, and the look he gave Thomas was full of disappointment and something that might have been disgust. "I received several letters this past week," Richard said, addressing the crowd. "Letters from people in this town detailing my son's behavior. His threats, his attempts at intimidation, his refusal to accept that he was beaten. I came back early from my business in Carson City to deal with this personally." "Father, they are lying," Thomas said desperately. "They are trying to destroy me because I am your son." "Be quiet," Richard said, and his voice was like a whip crack. Thomas flinched but fell silent. Richard looked at Tristan and Clara and then at the crowd. "My son has become a liability. More than that, he has become a disgrace. I have spent 30 years building my reputation in this territory, and he is destroying it with his petty vendettas and his inability to control his temper." "So what are you going to do about it?" Tristan asked. Richard was silent for a long moment, and Clara could see him struggling with the decision. Finally, he turned to Thomas. "You are leaving Belmont. Tonight. I am sending you to San Francisco to work in the shipping office there. You will stay there for at least 2 years, and if I hear even a whisper of you causing trouble, I will cut you off completely. No more allowance, no more using the family name to get what you want. You will be on your own." Thomas's face went white. "You cannot do this. I am your son." "And you have dishonored that relationship repeatedly," Richard said flatly. "I am done making excuses for you. I am done cleaning up your messes. This is your last chance, Thomas. Take it or leave it, but if you stay in Belmont, you will not have my protection anymore." The square was completely silent. Clara held her breath, waiting to see what Thomas would do. For a moment she thought he might actually refuse, might lash out at his father the way he had lashed out at everyone else. But then something seemed to break inside him, and his shoulders slumped. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "I will go to San Francisco." "Good," Richard said. He turned back to the crowd. "I apologize for my son's behavior. It does not excuse what he did, but I want you all to know that it ends here. If anyone has suffered damages because of Thomas, come to me and we will make it right. And if any of you see or hear of him returning to Belmont before I give permission, you have my authorization to notify the sheriff and have him removed." It was not exactly justice, Clara thought, but it was something. Thomas would be gone, sent away where he could not hurt anyone else. The threat that had been hanging over her and Tristan was lifted. She felt Tristan's hand find hers and squeeze gently, and she squeezed back, relief flooding through her. The crowd began to disperse, people talking in low voices, and Richard Yates approached Clara and Tristan directly. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. York, I owe you both an apology as well. My son should never have targeted you the way he did. I hope you can accept my assurance that it will not happen again." "Thank you, Mr. Yates," Clara said carefully. "I appreciate your intervention." Richard nodded and then looked at Tristan. "You stood up to my family twice now, York. That takes courage, or stupidity, I am not entirely sure which. But either way, you have my respect. If you ever need anything, come talk to me." It was an olive branch, Clara realized, Richard Yates's way of trying to make peace. Tristan seemed to recognize it as well, because he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir. I will remember that." Richard turned and walked back to his horse, calling for Thomas to follow. Clara watched them ride away together, father and son, and she wondered what their conversation would be like once they were alone. She felt a brief flash of pity for Thomas, who had been raised to believe he was entitled to everything and was now learning that entitlement had limits. But the pity was fleeting. Thomas had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. Tristan pulled Clara aside, away from the lingering crowd, and wrapped his arms around her. "It is over," he said quietly. "He is gone. We are safe." Clara buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, letting the tension drain out of her body. "I cannot believe it actually worked. I was so afraid something would go wrong." "So was I," Tristan admitted. "But we had the truth on our side, and enough people willing to stand up for it. That matters." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, and then Clara pulled back to look up at him. "So what happens now?" Tristan smiled, and it was the smile she loved, the one that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "Now we get to live our lives without looking over our shoulders. Now I buy that piece of land from Charlie and start building our house. Now you keep teaching and I keep working, and we figure out this whole future thing together." "I like the sound of that," Clara said softly. "So do I," Tristan replied. He bent and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Clara felt happiness bloom inside her chest like a flower opening to the sun. The rest of November and all of December passed in a blur of activity. Tristan bought the land from Charlie Clayton, and with the help of several men from town, they began work on a small house. It was simple, just 3 rooms to start with, but it was solid and well made, with a good roof and a stone fireplace. Clara helped when she could, bringing water and food for the workers, offering suggestions about where the windows should go and how the kitchen should be laid out. Tristan had asked her to marry him officially on Christmas Eve, going down on one knee in the tiny parlor of the boarding house with Mrs. Henderson and Sarah Chen as witnesses. He had no ring yet, he said apologetically, but he would get one as soon as he could. Clara had laughed and cried and said yes without hesitation, and Mrs. Henderson had broken out a bottle of elderberry wine to celebrate. They set the wedding for early February, giving them time to finish the house and for Clara to finish out the school year. The town rallied around them, everyone eager to help the couple who had stood up to the Yates family and won. Mrs. Henderson insisted on making Clara's wedding dress, a simple but beautiful creation in pale blue. Charlie Clayton offered to host the reception at the Double C. Even the minister, a circuit preacher named Reverend Walsh who came through Belmont once a month, agreed to perform the ceremony. As winter settled over the Nevada desert, cold and clear, Clara found herself happier than she had ever been. She loved teaching her students, watching them learn and grow. She loved her evening walks with Tristan, bundled in coats against the chill, talking about their plans and their dreams. She loved the way the house was slowly taking shape, becoming real instead of just an idea. She loved the way Tristan looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in his world. There were still challenges, of course. Money was tight, and Clara knew that their first few years would require careful management and hard work. The house would need furniture, the land would need fencing, and Tristan would need to build up his horse breeding operation from scratch. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The wedding took place on a brilliantly sunny February morning in 1884, with half the town in attendance. Clara wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Tristan had collected for her throughout the fall. Tristan wore a new suit that Charlie had insisted on buying him as a wedding gift, and he looked both proud and nervous as he stood at the altar waiting for Clara to walk down the aisle. There was no one to give Clara away, so she walked alone, her head high and her heart full. When she reached Tristan and he took her hand, she saw his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she had to blink back her own. Reverend Walsh spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through good times and hard times, and when he asked if they took each other as husband and wife, their voices rang out clear and certain. "I do." The kiss that sealed their marriage was met with cheers and applause, and Clara laughed against Tristan's lips, giddy with joy. They were married. They were starting their life together. Everything she had hoped for when she came west was coming true. The reception at the Double C was lively and warm, with music and dancing and more food than Clara had seen in one place since leaving Philadelphia. Charlie Clayton gave a speech about how Tristan had been like a son to him and how he was proud to see him happy and settled. Mrs. Henderson cried openly, declaring that she had never seen two people more suited for each other. Even Richard Yates sent a gift, a beautiful set of silver candlesticks with a note wishing them well, which Clara thought was his way of apologizing again for his son's behavior. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Tristan pulled Clara aside to a quiet corner. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Clara replied honestly. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you, Tristan York. I love the life we are building together. I love that we get to face whatever comes next as partners." "I love you too," Tristan said. "More than I can put into words. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for being worth choosing," Clara said, and she kissed him again, long and deep, not caring who might see. They spent their wedding night in the new house, which was not quite finished but was livable enough. Tristan had brought in a bed and a table, and someone had left flowers in a jar and firewood stacked by the hearth. They made love for the first time as husband and wife, tentative, and then passionate, learning each other's bodies with hands and mouths and whispered words. Afterward, Clara lay in Tristan's arms listening to his heartbeat and feeling utterly content. "This is just the beginning," Tristan murmured into her hair. "We have so much ahead of us." "I know," Clara said, "and I cannot wait to see it all." The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. Tristan built up his horse breeding operation slowly but steadily, developing a reputation for training animals that were both strong and gentle. Clara continued teaching, expanding her curriculum and starting a small lending library that became a source of pride for the whole town. They faced setbacks, of course. There were harsh winters and dry summers, years when money was tight and the future seemed uncertain. But they faced it all together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating together during the good times. They had their first child in the fall of 1885, a boy they named Daniel. He had Tristan's gray eyes and Clara's dark hair, and he was healthy and strong. Tristan was a devoted father, patient and loving, and Clara felt her heart expand watching him with their son. 2 years later came a daughter, Alice, who had her father's quiet strength and her mother's sharp mind. And 3 years after that, another son, James, who was loud and cheerful and kept them all on their toes. The house grew with the family, new rooms added as they could afford them, until it was a proper home with space for everyone. Clara planted a garden that somehow, against all odds, flourished in the Nevada soil. She grew vegetables and herbs, and even a few flowers that bloomed defiantly in the desert heat. Tristan built corrals and a barn, and the pastures filled with horses that people came from all over the territory to see and buy. Belmont itself changed too. The town grew, attracting new settlers and businesses. The school expanded, and Clara eventually hired a second teacher to help with the increasing number of students. Richard Yates passed away in 1890, and to everyone's surprise, his will included generous donations to the school and to several town improvement projects. Thomas never returned to Belmont, staying in San Francisco, where, according to rumors, he had married and settled into a quiet life running the family's shipping business. Clara liked to think that exile had taught him something about humility, though she was never quite sure. Through it all, Clara and Tristan's love deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of those early years softened into something steadier and more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. They still took evening walks when they could, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still looked at each other across crowded rooms and felt their hearts skip a beat. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tristan took Clara back to the little canyon where he had first told her he loved her. The children were with Mrs. Henderson for the night, and it was just the two of them under the stars, listening to the sound of water trickling over rocks. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Tristan asked, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "Of course I do," Clara said. "I was terrified you were going to say something that would break my heart, and instead you said the most perfect thing possible." "I was terrified too," Tristan admitted. "I thought for sure you would tell me I was being foolish, that a schoolteacher and a cowboy had no business falling in love." "We had every business falling in love," Clara said firmly. "We were exactly right for each other. We still are." "Yes, we are," Tristan agreed. He pulled her closer and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. "I never thought I would have this," he said after a while. "A home, a family, a life that matters. I spent so many years just drifting, afraid to want anything because I was afraid of losing it. And then I met you, and suddenly I wanted everything. I wanted roots and permanence and a future. You gave me all of that." "We gave it to each other," Clara corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were before I came to Belmont. I was looking for purpose, for a place where I belonged. I found it here with you. We built this life together, Tristan, every part of it." "I know," Tristan said, "and I am grateful for it every single day. For you, for our children, for this chance we got to create something meaningful." He paused, then added softly, "I love you, Clara, even more than I did on our wedding day, if that is possible." "It is possible," Clara said, her eyes bright with tears, "because I love you more now, too. Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." They kissed under the stars, and Clara felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt the very first time, that sense of rightness and belonging. They had faced down bullies and threats, had built a home and a family from nothing, had created a life that was rich and full and exactly what they had both dreamed of. And they had done it together, supporting each other every step of the way. When they finally rode back to their house, Clara looked at the warm light spilling from the windows and felt a profound sense of peace. This was home. This was love. This was everything she had crossed a continent to find, and more than she had ever dared to hope for. The years continued to roll by, each one adding new memories and new joys. Daniel grew into a serious young man who loved books almost as much as his mother did, and who eventually went east to study law. Alice proved to have her father's way with horses, and she became Tristan's right hand in the breeding operation, earning a reputation in her own right. James, the youngest, was the most like both his parents, combining Clara's fierce determination with Tristan's quiet strength, and he became a teacher like his mother, taking over the school when Clara finally retired. Clara and Tristan grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never wavering. They sat together on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the desert they had made their home, holding hands and remembering. They talked about the day Tristan had disarmed Thomas Yates over a horse named Copper, who had lived to a remarkable age and sired dozens of fine foals. They talked about the confrontation that had brought the whole town together, proving that ordinary people could stand up to power when they stood together. They talked about their wedding, their children, all the small and large moments that had made up their life. "You have any regrets?" Clara asked one evening when they were both in their 60s and the desert air was sweet with the promise of spring. Tristan thought about it for a long moment, his weathered hand warm in hers. "No," he said finally. "Not a single one. Every choice I made led me here to you, to this life." "How could I regret any of that?" "Good," Clara said, satisfaction in her voice. "Because neither do I. Coming to Belmont was the best decision I ever made. Meeting you, loving you, building this life with you, it has been everything I wanted and more. We did good, did we not?" Tristan said, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to tame and cultivate. "We made something that mattered. We raised good children. We stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. We loved each other well." "We did," Clara agreed. "We absolutely did." They sat there in the fading light, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful and lasting together. The landowner's son had said he could take what he wanted, that his family's power made him untouchable. But a cowboy had shown him he was very wrong, and in doing so, had found the love of his life and a purpose worth fighting for. And a schoolteacher from Philadelphia had found the courage to stand beside him, to build a life in a harsh land, and to prove that love and determination could overcome almost anything. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara leaned her head on Tristan's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling utterly content. They had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and meaning. And as the years continued to stretch before them, she knew that whatever time they had left would be spent together, facing whatever came with the same partnership and devotion that had carried them through everything else. Their story had started with a gunshot and a confrontation, with a wealthy young man who thought the world owed him whatever he wanted. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a story about courage and justice, about standing up for what was right even when it cost you. Most of all, it had become a love story, the kind that lasted a lifetime and beyond, the kind that changed not just two people but an entire community. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Thomas Yates had tried to take what did not belong to him, to impose his will through threats and violence. But he had been stopped by ordinary people who refused to give in, who stood together and said no. And from that resistance had grown something beautiful. A marriage, a family, a legacy of courage that would be remembered long after the Yates family's wealth had faded into history. Years later, when Clara and Tristan were both gone and their children were telling stories to their own grandchildren, people would still talk about the day a cowboy stood up to the landowner's son and won. They would talk about the schoolteacher who refused to be intimidated, about the town that came together to protect its own, about the love that grew from courage and conviction. And they would smile because it was a good story, a true story, a story that reminded people that power and money did not always win, that sometimes ordinary people could change the world just by refusing to back down. Clara and Tristan's house still stood on that piece of land south of Belmont, expanded and improved over the years, but still fundamentally the same home they had built together. Their children and grandchildren gathered there for holidays and celebrations, and the walls echoed with laughter and love. The garden Clara had planted still bloomed, tended now by other hands but thriving still. The corrals held horses bred from the stock Tristan had so carefully developed, carrying on his legacy. And in the schoolhouse in town, now a much larger building than the simple one-room structure Clara had first taught in, her portrait hung on the wall, a reminder to future generations of the teacher who had come west and changed everything. It was a life well lived, a love well earned, and a story worth telling. And somewhere in the great beyond, if such a place existed, Clara and Tristan were still together, still holding hands, still planning their next adventure. Because love like theirs did not end just because life did. It continued on, woven into the fabric of the world they had helped create, inspiring others to be brave, to stand up for what was right, and to believe that love could conquer all. The end came peacefully for both of them, first for Tristan in his sleep at the age of 72, and then for Clara just 6 months later, as if she could not bear to be without him for long. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their land, with a simple marker that read, Tristan and Clara York. They stood for justice and loved each other truly. Their legacy lives on. And it did live on, in every child who learned to read in the school Clara had championed, in every horse that bore the bloodlines Tristan had so carefully cultivated, in every person who heard their story and was inspired to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to stand up for what was right. They had made their mark on Belmont and on the territory, proving that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they acted with courage and love. The town of Belmont, Nevada itself eventually faded, as many Western towns did, but the story of Clara and Tristan endured. Their descendants carried it with them wherever they went, telling and retelling it, keeping alive the memory of two people who had refused to let bullies win, who had built something beautiful out of the harsh desert landscape, and who had loved each other with a fierce and enduring devotion that became the stuff of legend. In the end, the landowner's son had indeed been very wrong. He had thought his family's power meant he could take whatever he wanted, could hurt whoever he pleased without consequence. But he had not counted on a cowboy with gray eyes and quiet strength, or a schoolteacher with more courage than sense, or a town full of ordinary people who decided that enough was enough. He had not counted on love, which turned out to be the most powerful force of all. And so the story ended, not with violence or tragedy, but with love triumphant, with justice served, with a life well lived and a legacy that would echo through generations. Clara and Tristan had shown everyone that character mattered more than wealth, that courage counted for more than power, and that love, true love, could overcome almost anything. It was a lesson worth learning, a story worth remembering, and a life worth celebrating. They had lived and loved and built something that mattered, and in the end, that was everything.